Good afternoon and a very good welcome to you to Conway Hall online events. Conway Hall is run by Conway Hall Ethical Society. We're an incredibly old ethical society, had a long continued unbroken tradition since I think the late 18th century. We've been going a long time, we do some really good work, and I hope you'll enjoy the talk we have this afternoon. We're very lucky to have Graham Hutchings, the author of China, 1949. Graham is an associate at the University of Oxford's China Centre, and he's an honorary professor at the University of Nottingham. He was managing director and then managing editor at Oxford Analytica. He's been China correspondent for the Daily Telegraph, and he's also written Modern China, a companion to rising power. He's going to speak to us this afternoon for about 45 minutes, and I'm sure you'll have loads of questions. So please do write in the little question section that you've got. What'll happen is when he's finished, we'll take the questions. I'm quite happy to ask them on your behalf if you're uncomfortable to do so. If you want to, that's absolutely fine. We'll try and get you on. Just one note of warning, you might need the most modern version of Zoom. We've sometimes had situations where people haven't been able to get their voices heard, but I've asked the questions on their behalf, so that's fine. You'll still get through. This afternoon, Graham is talking to us about the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. The change from an outward-looking capitalist pro-Western government to the rise of Mao Zedong and the effects that it's had on both China and the rest of the world. Over to you, Graham.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Deborah. I hope everybody can hear me and can see me. More importantly, can see the slides that I'm showing. I'm going to assume that everybody can. And let me say a warm greeting to reinforce Deborah's message to everybody who's joined us. I do appreciate people giving up their Sunday afternoon for a talk of this nature. It's good to be in such distinguished company. Perhaps I can repay the debt that I owe you for joining me by giving you an alternative to thinking about our present year, because I don't know about you, but by my calculation, we've had less than 50 days of 2021, and I so far don't think very much of it at all. If you're in that same category, then I've got some good news for you. For the next 90 minutes, we're going to think about another year, one that is unfolding in a different part of the world. I cannot say to you that it is a year of comfort, tranquility, and ease. Rather, it is one of tension, of turbulence, and of trauma. But we do have the advantage of living this year vicariously. There will be an end to it after our time together, and we can return to such pleasures as 2021 in the United Kingdom has for us. The case for thinking about 1949 is, however, more than simply that of finding an alternative to our present predicament, because it is a year of some significance. You don't have to just take my word for that. In the early weeks of 1950, the military attaché at the British Embassy in Beijing was obliged to give some account of 1949 to his masters in London. And he rather incisively and I think validly offered the verdict that you see there. He elaborated on it a little in the dispatch that he sent to London. He said that the year 1949 is particularly significant in the military sphere. Never before has a civil war been waged with so many troops over so vast an area. Over 5 million nationalist and communist soldiers, the military attaché said, have been engaged, while the victorious armies, i.e. those of Mao Zedong's communists, in many cases have finished up 1,000 miles from where they started and have crushed all organized resistance by nationalist forces on the mainland, with the exception of a few armies scattered over West China. Now, to make an incisive judgment like that in the heat and the dust of the moment is a rather difficult thing to do. Historians, when they consider a year, have the advantage of distance, the advantage of perspective, and the ability to weigh the evidence and reach their judgments. The military attaché had none of that. And that is why perhaps he didn't, at that particular juncture, flesh out his judgment in the way that we can. Because 1949, it is now clear, was a year of fundamental and disruptive change in China's history. It brought to power a revolutionary movement, Chairman Mao's Chinese Communist Party, that was determined to uproot China's traditional political, social, and economic order and replace it with a new one, Red China, Revolutionary China, New China. It was also, in so doing, a critical year in the history of the Soviet-led international communist movement. Now, one doesn't hear so much about that these days, but of course, in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and indeed into the 70s, it was a vital force in shaping global outcomes and was the source of global contest throughout the world. What Mao's victory in 1949 did was it brought the Cold War to Asia. In fact, rather more than that, it brought the world's most populous country into the global socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. And broadly speaking, for the last 70 years or so since 1949, China has never been in the Western orbit, despite the dreams of certain Western leaders. But we can go on in emphasizing and indeed understanding the importance of this year before we get into the meat of it, because it was a year in which the final phases, all but one, we might say, for a reason that I hope will become apparent, were being fought of a bitter civil war, waged rather, as that military attaché pointed out, across vast swathes of the country. Like all civil wars, the Chinese version tore families apart. It sundered friendships. It ruined millions of lives, and it forced hundreds of thousands, indeed millions, into exile. But it was also a source of revolutionary commitment and enthusiasm on the part of many Chinese, the chance to remake their country. So essentially, it was a year in which human tragedy and human triumph coexisted, often on a heart-rending scale. But it did even more than that, as if this list was not long enough, because 1949 created two Chinas. The China, the defeated version, if you like, of Chiang Kai-Shek and his nationalists, who were forced at the end of 1949 to retreat to the island of Taiwan, and the new China of Mao Zedong, which was in control of all the mainland. Here is an interesting observation we might make, because we all understand that China is a country with enormous global standing at the moment, and yet, unlike most global powers in history, perhaps not all, but most, it is a country that is still not unified. It hasn't gone through the phase of national reunification that occurred before, for example, Italy, or Germany, or the United Kingdom, or indeed the United States, really punched weight on the international stage. It is, in short, 1949, the source of an unfinished civil conflict between Beijing, the People's Republic of China, and Taipei, which calls itself the Republic of China. And what we see in the present juncture, that is to say, as we speak, are strong indications from the leadership in Beijing that this matter must be decided, that China's unification must be carried out, and if that takes a resumption of conflict across the Taiwan Straits, then Beijing says, so be it. National destiny requires that to take place. So I hope I built a little bit of a case worthy of your attention as we spend our time together this afternoon. And to reinforce it, I'd like to move through 1949 by way of a journey, perhaps to treat the year as if it were like a Chinese scroll that we would unfold together and focus on various events, on various scenes, perhaps referring to individual personalities at various stages. And so understand the year in its richness and complexity, and particularly why it means so much in contemporary politics and affects so many more people than just the Chinese some thousands of miles away. If we do that, I think we'll see a story of personal struggles, of privations, but also of revolutionary commitment and revolutionary enthusiasm. Let's then proceed along those lines and spend a little bit of time with the leaders on both sides, as it were, scene one, stop one in our travel through the year or the scroll of 1949. Here at the top, we see Chairman Mao. At the bottom, we see his great rival, Chiang Kai-Shek, or to give him the proper Mandarin pronunciation, Chiang leader of the Republic of China, of the Nationalist government. Naturally, at the end of 1948 and the beginning of 1949, we find them not only in very different parts of China, but in different moods as well. These two men, incidentally, as many of you may be aware, had been engaged in a bitter struggle for the soul of China, for control of their country's destiny, since the late 1920s. They were men who had certain characteristics in common: an iron resolution, a sense of purpose and mission. They, of course, had great differences between them. For Mao, it was a socialist, one almost might say a utopian vision that was driving him, a sense that China could be changed radically with revolutionary upheaval and alliance with the Soviet Union. Whilst Chiang Kai-shek felt that there were, in the way in which China was already constructed, traditions and ways of life, continuities that needed to be preserved, and that reform rather than revolution was what was really required. They had, by the end of 48, beginning of 1949, reached a critical stage in the Civil War. We can think of the Civil War in terms of a military conflict as really beginning in the middle of 1946 and ending in one respect at the end of our year, 1949. Well, how had things turned out by the end of 1948 and the beginning of 1949? They had turned out very much in favor of Mao Zedong. Chiang Kai-shek is in Nanjing, the capital of China at that time. He has had a terrible year in 1948. The communists have taken Manchuria up there in the northeast of the country, which was China's industrial heartland. He was on the point of losing nearly all of North China, that huge stretch of country north of the Yangtze and going up to Beijing and Tianjin. Those two cities, incidentally, were besieged. They were still controlled by Chiang's government, but they were besieged at the end of 1948 and the opening days of 1949. It was a matter of time. Everybody accepted Chiang too, I think, before they fell. Things had reached such a pass indeed that when Chiang invited his senior officials to a New Year's Eve soiree in his residence in Nanjing, 31st of December 1948, gunfire, artillery could be heard coming across the other side of the Yangtze River. The mood was sullen. Fireworks lit the sky and there was fine food at this reception, but no one was in much of a mood to enjoy it. Chiang's wife, Song Mei-ling, had in the previous November flown to Washington and sought to get Washington to turn the taps on in terms of military aid, military advice again, and rescue Chiang's government. President Truman had entertained her with tea and sympathy, but very little else. Chiang had decided at this juncture that he would have to step down, that his government, such as it was, would have to try and negotiate with Mao up there in the north, and some sort of peace talks, hopefully, he thought, might lead to what? Well, perhaps time above all things, time for him to strengthen the defenses of South China and enable him to put up a much bigger fight for that part of the country, which he hoped to keep clear and clean of communism. Time perhaps for the Americans to change their mind. Time perhaps for some sort of coalition government to be set up with Mao's communists of the kind that would allow him to stay in power in the South in some form, or at least his colleagues to do so in his absence. These were the calculations that were in Chiang's mind as he told his astonished guests at that reception that, as for my own position, I have no concerns at all. As long as peace is secured, I will follow the will of the people. His colleagues, senior members of his Nationalist Party, were astonished by this turn of events. They had partly hoped for it, but as we will see, they were also much afraid of it because it meant that they would have to step up to the front and negotiate a peace with the Chinese Communist Party, and that didn't look as though it was going to be very easy. And that perspective was well justified, because if we turn now to where Mao was at this juncture, Mao in his 56th year, the undisputed leader of the movement that he had brought to the cusp of power in China, was in a very different place from Nanjing, with its electric lights, its modern roads and railways, and its fine buildings. He was in a village in the Taihang mountain range, about 200 miles southwest of Beijing. He hadn't taken that city yet, but he was about to. He and his senior comrades, Liu Shaoqi, the man who looked after the labor movement and party discipline, Zhou Enlai, the so-called suave diplomat of the Chinese Communist movement, and Zhu De, the military commander, were in a village constituted of mud-baked walled houses and simple dwellings surrounded by mountains and set among cypress trees. Mao was confident. The victories of the previous months or so had made him that. He'd set up a unified government in North China, and he said that the number of troops in the People's Liberation Army was now very close to that under Chiang's control, and victory might well come across the country sooner than anticipated. But he wasn't yet able to say that victory would come within the space of a year, and neither did he think it was going to be as smooth in 1949 as the previous year had been, and indeed as 1949 in fact turned out. And whereas Chiang was speaking of peace, Mao urged his comrades and supporters to carry the revolution through to the end. The nationalist leaders, he said in that kind of language that seems to come naturally to communist movements, were gangs of bandits and venomous snakes. He demanded that the Chinese people show them no mercy. The revolution must not be abandoned halfway, for the enemy will not perish of himself. So we see the situation there very favorably tipped towards Mao Zedong, but victory, if in sight, very far from being accomplished. Let's move away for our second scene from the perspective of the national leaders or rivals for such in China to how it was seen further afield, and in particular from the capitals of the world powers, that is to say, Washington, Moscow, and London. In Washington, as we've indicated, the Americans were fed up with Chiang Kai-shek. They had supported him unequivocally during the war against Japan, when his government was an ally of the liberal democracies fighting against the Nazis and against Japan. In the Civil War, it was a different matter. They had become disillusioned with Chiang. He was not strong enough to win the Civil War, and the Americans felt even if they threw everything at him in the way of aid, money and advice that they could, he still wouldn't be able to win. Worse, he had no, let me rephrase that, he had little credibility in the eyes of many Chinese people. He was not someone able to mobilize his people against what he, after all, did feel was a real threat to the future of his country. And yet the Americans were very aware that though not strong, Chiang was not someone they could simply drop. They weren't ready, if Mao Zedong was indeed going to set up a new government in China, to recognize him. We have a Cold War unfolding at this juncture, don't forget. We've had the Berlin air crisis, the blockade being broken, the blockade imposed by the Soviet Red Army and broken by the airlift. We have a situation in Greece and Turkey where the Americans feel they've got to step in to stop the advance of Russian Soviet communist interests in those two countries. And here is China on the cusp too. So the Americans are not ready to abandon Chiang. Perhaps he might yet be able to hold on. Perhaps somewhere in China he could form a base which might be worth supporting. So he's too important to abandon. We see a different perspective naturally unfolding if we look at Moscow's point of view. Here we have Stalin, who has for years been supporting the Chinese Communist movement with advice, with military advisors, with some weapons, not on the scale that Chiang is able to get from the Americans, but supporting a fellow communist movement. But Stalin is ever suspicious. Mao Zedong is an enigma to Stalin. What kind of mentality and ideology does this man have? He's not very well informed about him. He, of course, and his Politburo colleagues in Moscow are pleased with the way the Chinese Revolution is going. They are pleased to see the defeat of Chiang Kai-Shek and the harm that's inflicting on Western, especially American interests. But he can't quite believe that victory is going to come swiftly and completely as it does. Surely the Americans will come in and support Chiang at some stage. That's one set of worries for him. Another is that Mao might be like Tito in Yugoslavia, causing Stalin a lot of headaches by his independent line on various issues. Worse, he could perhaps not be Asia's Tito, he could be Asia's Lenin. That is to say, the revolution, though in China helped in a number of ways by the Soviets, is really sui generis, is really independent. Might Mao, Stalin thinks, if he's too successful and too quick about it, eventually be a challenger to his own position as leader of the Soviet camp. So Stalin is wary of Mao just as much as he is pleased with the progress of the Red cause in China. And let's turn to, finally, in this quick survey of attitudes towards 1949 in world capitals, to London. Here we see Ernest Bevin and his Prime Minister Clement Attlee. This is, of course, a reforming Labour government after the war, a government whose members are not very keen on imperialism and colonialism, but are rather attracted to the idea of empire and not very keen to abandon it. What they're thinking of, as the scene in China unfolds before them, is that very considerable stake that the UK PLC, if you like, has in Shanghai, China's great global city, its global metropolis. Here there are very significant business interests, and London has no real stake in the battle between Mao and Chiang. It would prefer Mao not to achieve victory and bring China too close to the Soviet Union, but it doesn't have quite the interests that the United States has. It wants to protect its investment. It's also keen, of course, that its control of Hong Kong should not be challenged. So we see Shanghai, where British material interests are located, and we see Hong Kong, where British prestige, if you like, is centered. There is also the wider imperial dimension. That is to say, if Mao sweeps over China and establishes the red flag across that country, then Chinese elsewhere under British rule, notably, but not only in Malaya and Singapore, are going to be much moved, and that could create headaches. Then those are the perspectives as seen from the powers as this great drama unfolds. We ought to spend a few moments in our next part of this Odyssey thinking about Chiang's own house, because not only has his cause suffered enormous setbacks, as it will throughout 1949, it is essentially a house divided. And here we see two people whose names may or may not be familiar to you. Don't worry too much if not. The point I'm making here is that they are sectional interests within Chiang's own Nationalist Party, people who had been, broadly speaking, on his side and in support of his principles and the idea of a Republic of China that is reforming, broadly speaking, pro-Western, but very angry with him at the pass to which they believe he has brought their country and keen for reforms. Chiang sees them in a different light. He sees them as factional rebels, as people who would in extremis sign a deal with the Chinese Communist Party to preserve their own interests. What Chiang said at that soiree on New Year's Eve that we referred to earlier was that the reason I'm resigning is not actually because of the communists, it's because of pressure from a faction within my own party. And he was thinking of the Guangxi faction. Guangxi is a province in the southwest of the country that had been quasi-independent for a long time under its leaders Bai Chongxi and Li Zongren. These were the two men whose rivalry with Chiang really impeded his cause throughout 1949 and helped enable the communists to accomplish their victory so smoothly and quickly. Let's go to the battle lines for a moment in our next stop in this excursion through 1949. Here are two bitter rivals. They happen to be two of the best generals on either side of the Chinese Civil War. Bai Chongxi on the right there, we've just spoken about, the man in charge of the Guangxi faction, and Lin Biao, a man who was to go on to great things in the People's Republic of China until 1971, when he died in a plane crash in Mongolia, in circumstances that frankly are still not as clear as they might be. These two men as rivals had form. They, rather like Mao and Chiang, were early devotees of the idea of revolution in China. For Bai Chongxi on the right, it was the ideals of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China, and the man whose ideas formed the main mission and policies of Chiang's government. Lin Biao on the left was dedicated to the revolutionary cause of Marxism-Leninism from very early years. They made their careers, these two men, in the armies of either side. They had fought before 1949 in the Northeast, and in that encounter, Bai Chongxi, generally speaking, had come off better. In 1949, we see them in a different situation. These two men are in charge of armies that sit opposite each other across the Yangtze River in the center of China around the great city of Wuhan. Lin Biao's 4th Field Army is a supremely efficient fighting unit of Mao's PLA. It might at this juncture have about 1 million soldiers, well armed and provided for. They've got hold of Japanese weapons and they've got hold of Soviet weapons. Bai Chongxi is just south of the Yangtze, perhaps with half that number. Many of them his own Guangxi soldiers, very able, very experienced, but now unevenly matched. And the story of 1949 for these two men is of triumph for Lin Biao and utter calamitous defeat for Bai Chongxi. Lin forces Bai's armies ever south and destroys them in Bai's home province of Guangxi. In fact, at the end of 1949, we find Bai Chongxi's headquarters operating out of a former Roman Catholic church in the island of Hainan, down there near the Vietnamese border. His army's crushed, his career is over, and despite the long enmity that he had with Chiang Kai-Shek that we've spoken of, he had no alternative but, at the end of 1949, to fly to Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, to which Chiang has retreated, and a life of relative obscurity. We've spoken about diplomats and world leaders. We've spoken about the leaders of the two camps in China and about the military leaders, Lin Biao and Bai Chongxi. We ought never to forget that we're dealing with a civil war and the horrors of a civil war, and we need to spend a little bit of time as we unroll a further piece of this scroll with ordinary people and how it affected them. Throughout 1948 and 1949, China's roads were crowded with refugees. So were the trains, so were the ships. Riverine transport was a very important means of getting about, and in this case, getting away in China. There were, of course, flights, but very few seats on what was anyway small planes. So although people did escape by air, particularly from Shanghai and from Nanjing, most did so by the means that I've already referred to. Why were people fleeing? Well, it was something of a mystery to Edward Knox Little, whose quotation you'll see at the bottom of this slide. He was a foreigner in charge of a department of the Chinese government. That was a system that had been set up in the 19th century and was coming to an end. And he wrote in his diary about the tendency, as he saw it, of the Chinese to flee. That struck me as a rather peculiar, eccentric thing to note, since the country was engulfed in civil war, and moreover, that Little himself was fleeing from one city to another at the time. Let's spend a moment thinking about two, as it were, ordinary people in this great flight to avoid the fighting, the flight to avoid communism. It wasn't understood by many in China, unless communism, of course, had captured that part of the country in which they were living. There was a lot that was unknown about it. What was certain was that the promise that Mao offered to many people that was exciting, of change and transformation, was to others a matter of apprehension, anxiety, and fear. It was important to get away, to get one's family and friends away if one could, to protect one's assets. Everywhere across China, people on the move. Mei Jun, the woman who you see at the bottom left of this slide, is someone we want to spend a few moments with, because her story gives us something of a taste of what it was like to live during this traumatic time. At the age of 24, she, Mei Jun, left her native village in Zhejiang, southeast China, with her infant son strapped across her back. She said to her mother, "I will be back soon," and then marched out. What seems to have motivated her flight was the fact that her husband, who was serving a long way away, was a member of Chiang's military police and could expect to face repercussions. Her plan, such as it was to catch a train or any other means into central South China and in the province of Hunan, leave her infant son with her mother-in-law. Having done that with great difficulty, she then moved south. Mei Jun's was a 15-month journey backwards and forwards across China that ended up in early 1950 in Taipei. Having dropped her son off and made her way further south, she got to Guangzhou, the city of South China, some 60 miles north of Hong Kong, and spent a few months there. But she saw that city filling up with refugees. The war, remember, is moving from north to South China. It's coming ever closer. Defeated soldiers are arriving. Civilian refugees are arriving. Scenes of chaos unfold. She decides that she must go north again and collect her son and bring him out of this mayhem and chaos. She's then going against the flow of traffic. For some of the way, she can travel by train, but somebody, unknown at this stage, has already destroyed the railway track, and she has to walk alongside it with some others for a while to reach the village. She reunites with her son, but getting a train back down south is very, very difficult. You will see from these pictures here how crowded the trains were. She decides that she cannot take an infant on a journey in those circumstances and has to leave him again. Late in 1949, we find her too on Hainan Island, where Bai Chongxi had been. It's now the opening weeks of 1950, and the refugees are seeking to leave Hainan just before Lin Biao's communists attack it or liberate it, to use their language. She, Mei Jun, seeks to get away by boat along with hundreds of thousands of others. There are a few ships there which can evacuate people. She recorded people pulled themselves up ladders to get over the ship's rails into boats like so many spiders. Many could not make it and fell into the water. Cries of help went up, but no one could pay any attention. Cotton shoes bobbed up and down in the harbor. Wounded soldiers who had protected the retreat lay on the dockside crying in pain. Those on board the ships could only look back helplessly, abandoning them to their fate. Well, she got out, and she arrived some weeks later in the South Taiwanese port of Kaishek. She gave birth shortly after doing so to a daughter who provided the account of her mother's travails, on which I drew for this section of the book. Let's switch briefly to the experience of another person trying to get away, and that person is the Taiwanese-based poet, as he's now known, Ya Xian. In 1948, the latter part of 1948, he was a schoolboy in Henan, the province just north of the Yangtze River. The war came to Henan. Excuse me. The teachers, with the parents' permission, decided they would have to take their charges out of school and move them south to imagine safety. The plan would be to educate them along the way, insofar as that was possible. Ya Xian was about 14. He was rounded up and marched out of his home city of Nanyang south. At that time, he recalled, I had no idea of what goodbye or farewell meant. It was an alien concept to me. My grandfather came to see me off, but I didn't even acknowledge him. We just marched on, following our teachers. I was alone, independent. That was the last contact I ever had with my family. This group of, it amounted to thousands in the end, of school children went south across the river, deep down into Hunan, and were proposing to move further southwest out of the way of fighting, when Ya Xian and a couple of his chums saw in the city that they were staying at a poster asking for young men of vigor and patriotism to join a new army that Chiang Kai-Shek was creating on Taiwan. These young men, a handful of them from Ya Xian's group, were inspired by this to leave their parents, I beg your pardon, their teachers, and make their own way. They too went down to Guangzhou and caught a ship to Taiwan, where they were recruited as youth soldiers into the Nationalist army. Ya Xian went on to make his name as a literary figure, as we've indicated, but that story of his forced departure from home and family scored him for the rest of his life. Let's move away from these individual tales for the moment to the battlefield scene, the key battlefield incident of 1949, and that was the crossing of the Yangtze River. It had always been Chiang Kai-shek's hope that the communists could be persuaded to stay north of the Yangtze and for the country to be split almost between the north and the south, a communist north and a nationalist south. Mao Zedong and his senior comrades were having none of that, thank you very much. They knew that unless they toppled Chiang Kai-shek's government in the south, they would never be able to rule the whole of China, and it might even be difficult to hang on to the north because the south, by comparison, is so prosperous. So Mao was committed, but commitment is one thing, and organization and accomplishment another. The crossing of the Yangtze was an extraordinary accomplishment. It was a 500-mile front. The nationalists thought that that natural barrier of the Yangtze was worth about 500,000 soldiers to them and would deter the communists. And there was indeed some talk amongst the rank and file PLA about apprehension and anxiety on undertaking this task. This bit of doggerel that you'll see on this slide was going the rounds amongst the troops of the PLA about their apprehension. These were mostly northern soldiers moving into South China. It was almost like another country to them, whether you think of cuisine or language or geography, or whether South China was something special, something unknown, and they weren't sure how easy it would be to get across the river and to carry on their cause and defeat the nationalists. Well, it turned out to be much easier than anticipated. I think perhaps you can see, oh, I may have gone a little bit too far there. With my cursor, I'm indicating along the Yangtze River where on the night of April the 20th, the PLA first crossed. What happened to the peace talks, you may be saying to yourself, that we spoke of earlier? Well, these did indeed get underway. Somewhat ironically, they began on April the 1st, 1949, and they ended on April the 20th without any agreement. Mao Zedong and his commanders said the peace talks are really about the terms under which the nationalists are going to surrender. It's not about forming a coalition government. It's not about sharing power. It's not about dividing the country. So once those formal talks had ended, and they were a formality in many respects, on the night of April the 20th, and throughout the days that followed, the PLA moved across the Yangtze in force. They had organized a flotilla, a positive armada indeed, of small craft to take them across the river and to carry their cause into South China. At 5 p.m., one reporter observed the communist artillery opened up and an armada of tiny boats emerged from their hiding places. The troops embarked without lights, lying on the gunwales, their weapons resting on the edge of the boats. Thousands of white and rust-red sails were hoisted to the wind. The boats pushed off with their cheering cargoes. Time magazine told its worldwide readers of a stunning, swift disaster in China. Nearly 1 million communist troops along a 400-mile front poured across the Yangtze, nationalist China's last great defensive barrier, and swept government positions aside like puny earthworks in a raging tide. The communists moved with impressive speed. In 4 days, they took Nanjing, the capital, cut off Shanghai, and captured half a dozen strategic nationalist cities. It wasn't long, indeed, before the PLA, who had, we'll recall, been apprehensive about what they would see on the south of the river when they got there, were complaining that the Kuomintang, the nationalist troops, were retreating so fast they couldn't catch up with them and fight. It was a remarkable turn of events. We ought not to forget that the Chinese Civil War, though won on the battlefield and essentially a military affair, was more than that. There were the great follow-up ranks of the southbound cadres. These are the young men and women of North China, largely, who rallied to Mao's cause, who were inspired by the idea of rebuilding their country, of re-establishing its standing in the world, and particularly on ending the Western presence in their country that had been a feature of the last 100 years. These were the men and women who followed the troops. They were civilians, but they were tasked with running the territories that the PLA had taken over. What we see here is North China people again moving to the south. General He Long of Mao's PLA said, in the past, Southern comrades came to the north to fight the Japanese imperialists and liberate the northern people. It's now the job of comrades from the north to wage revolution in the south and liberate the people there, thoroughly eradicating the reactionary rule of the Kuomintang. These were the people who prepared for land reform. And again, we see the skill of the communists in organization. Rules and procedures were set up and drawn out, providing, for example, each one of the people we see depicted representatively on this slide with a suit of clothes and a pair of shoes for the journey south. Those above a certain rank could take with them an ox, one horse, and a rider. Those at another level could, when traveling in a group of 40, hire a truck to carry their belongings. Anyone who owned a bicycle was welcome to take it with them, the regulations said, but there was no question of the party paying for repairs. These were the people, as I've indicated, who carried out land reform. And this was such an important element of Mao's appeal to the people and to the peasantry in particular. You could not say that there was right across the country during this period an agricultural crisis, but certainly there was a great deal of rural inequity and rural injustice and rural cruelty. Mao's promise to the peasants to give them land, carried out in those areas where the communists were in control, was an inspiration, and it gave them a stake in the order that those fighting for Chiang Kai-Shek didn't have. And both armies were composed of peasants, but those fighting for Mao had a promise of something afterwards that those fighting for Chiang did not have. Let's turn, as we move through our journey and indeed see something of the end of the year in sight, to the experience of the cities. We spoke just now about the importance of the countryside. Recall that the communist movement in China was essentially grounded in rural insurrection. And it was a question, as Mao and his partners pointed out in the revolutionary cause, of the countryside encircling the cities. But the communists could not just take the countryside and hope to rule the country. They had to move into Chinese cities. These were big, complex, bureaucratic organizations, and this was a real challenge for the Communist Party. Up to this point, the start of 1949, they'd only ever run one big city, and that wasn't a huge one. It was the city of Harbin, up there in the north, close to the Soviet border, which they'd taken over in 1946. What happened in 1949 was that they took all the big cities of the south, Nanjing, Shanghai, Hangzhou, Wuhan, Guangzhou, and so on. And Mao constantly pointed out that we have to change tactics, we have to find allies in the cities, we have to work with existing forces to some extent and manage these places properly, because if not, we'll be driven out and we'll have to, as it were, start again. We will be just a rural insurrectionist movement and not a genuine government over the whole country. Well, in only one major city in 1949 was there protracted fighting for control between the government and the communists, and that was the capital of Shanxi province, a place called Taiyuan. Interestingly, this was run not so much by Chiang and the central government of the Nationalists, but by a local warlord, we might call him that, I think, called Yanxi Shan. And there was indeed bitter fighting. The people of Taiyuan fighting on the government side had nowhere to go and fought to the very end. In the other cities, the communists moved in relatively quietly, apart from the firecrackers and the jubilation that they in part organized and was in part spontaneous. They had not really to fight for any of them. Such military actions that took place, and this refers especially to Shanghai, were the result of nationalist rearguard actions, of evacuation rather than anything else. At the same time, we must acknowledge that in none of these cities, apart from secret Communist Party members operating in them, was there a real demand for the government to go and the communists to come in. There were no spontaneous rebellions against the government. No less telling, I suppose, is the fact that in none of the cities that the communists took relatively easily were the nationalists able to make any kind of comeback. Let's think about an individual, and particularly in the Shanghai context, of a capitalist as the communists drew near. What were the dilemmas going on in the mind of Liu Hongshang? He was a man who was regarded as the match and cement and flour king of Shanghai. His businesses were wholly Chinese owned, and he looked, as did his partners, with consternation at the approach of communism to this great city where he'd built his empire. At first, he sent some of his assets and people to Taiwan, where he knew Chiang Kai-Shek was building a base for final defense. But he was so disgusted with the poor management of the economy, not so much in Taiwan, but in Shanghai under Chiang Kai-Shek, that he said that won't work at all. One of his sons had secretly become a member of the Communist Party and urged Dad to stay put. The communists aren't going to be as bad as you fear, he said. Dad, as in the way of things, I suppose, was not happy to take his son's advice at this critical juncture, and so he, along with many of his assets, moved to Hong Kong, the Crown Colony. He did so shortly before the communists arrived. In the weeks that followed, arrived in Shanghai, I should say, in the weeks that followed, his associates and family members said to Liu, "You must come back from Hong Kong. You know, it's much better than we feared in Shanghai under the communists, and you can do a lot more business there." Towards the end of 1949, these appeals began to have an effect on Liu Hongshang, and so did an appeal from Zhou Enlai, because the communists now had control of much of the country. He made the direct appeal to Liu, and in November 1949, Liu secretly got a steamer, a cargo ship, moving from Hong Kong to the north, and arrived and was feted by Zhou Enlai, and moved back to Shanghai and became, in public at least, a supporter of the new regime. "I don't want to remain in Hong Kong where, under foreign rule, I'll be a white Chinese," as he described himself. He was in public thereafter a supporter of Mao's cause, but he had cause to regret that later, because in the 1950s, all his enterprises were nationalized and his business empire collapsed. By the 1st of October, the communist victory is not sealed on the mainland, but it's getting very close. And certainly it is time to create the new state. This had been long in the planning. When we first encountered Mao and Chiang, the end of 1948 and 1949, Mao had already determined that Beijing would be the new capital and that the People's Republic of China would be the new state. And here we see in the events of the founding of the PRC, the creation of the political culture, of the institutions, of the modus operandi that has really characterized China ever since. China would be a people's democratic dictatorship. The people would be those who supported the party. If you didn't support the party because you were a landlord, because you were a member of the Kuomintang, because you were a capitalist, you were not one of Mao's people, and you would be subject to dictatorship. That principle essentially applies in contemporary China today. What would also happen with the founding of the PRC was a tremendous burst of revolutionary enthusiasm and commitment on the part of many people who were caught up in the events. Chinese people attended meetings and were mobilized on a scale that they had never been before for this new cause. Mao was determined to reshape minds and reshape men and women. He also announced with the founding of the PRC that China would switch global allegiance. It would now be a member of the global socialist camp led by the Soviet Union. New China would lean to one side. New language, new institutions, genuine enthusiasm we see for this new revolutionary cause, along with a great deal of psychological pressure to conform to the new way of doing things. Let's, as the penultimate part of this odyssey through 1949, think about the situation down there in 1949. Remember, Hong Kong is under British control. It has been for a century. It's a matter of national humiliation for many patriotic Chinese that they should still be part of the country under colonial rule. And the British were very concerned whether the PLA under Mao and his fellow leaders would stop at the frontier of Hong Kong and mainland China, or would they sweep south and take back the colony and accomplish, as it were, a truly remarkable victory by kicking the foreigners out. The anxiety that the British felt was intensified by the speed with which the communists crossed the Yangtze, and especially by the HMS Amethyst incident of April 1949. That might be something that you are familiar with. This was the case of a Royal Navy frigate, for reasons that we still don't fully understand, was moved by the Admiralty or by the local naval commanders in Shanghai upriver to Nanjing to serve as guard ship of the capital of China at that stage, at precisely the moment when the communists were about to launch their attack. What we know from Chinese sources is that when this ship appeared, there was a great deal of anxiety about what to do. If it got in the way of the crossing and was damaged, then perhaps the British or the Americans might intervene in the Civil War. The communists nonetheless decided that it was an obstacle that had to be dealt with, and they opened fire on it. And something like 40 to 50 of the ship's company on HMS Amethyst were killed, and the vessel was stranded up the Yangtze for the following 3 or 4 months, finally making a daring escape down the Yangtze, out past Shanghai and into the Pacific, with, as the British are rather good at, turning humiliation into a great triumph. But when down in Hong Kong they saw this, they began to be anxious about the future of Hong Kong. So Attlee's government decided to reinforce the colony. They moved in many soldiers, they strengthened the air force, and they moved a carrier force close to the colony. Not that they thought that this would stop the PLA if battle was enjoined, but that it might raise the barrier. It might be something of a deterrent. In fact, of course, Mao had no intention of moving south at this juncture. He was just taking over this vast continental-sized country. The last thing he could really do was entangle himself with the British and worry about Hong Kong. And so we have, as depicted in this intriguing photograph on the right, an encounter in November 1949 between the communist paramilitaries of the Red Army and a British policeman suitably attired in his capacious shorts. A striking encounter, one that enabled Hong Kong to survive as a British Crown colony until midnight on June the 30th, 1997. Chiang Kai-Shek, we began with him, didn't we? Let's conclude with him. He had spent 1949 firstly stepping down, and secondly making sure that there was a bolt hole, making sure there was a place of last resort to which his government could flee. Okay, the Americans wouldn't support him. He would survive alone, and he would do so in Taiwan. So he spent his so-called retirement shifting key assets to that island offshore, about 100 miles off the coast. Those assets included military equipment, the military command, but they also included China's foreign exchange reserves, its holding of gold and silver. And critically, it included as many of China's arts and treasures as could be shipped out from uh, museums and other places of exhibition before the communists came. And that was important for Chiang because he realized that part of the legitimacy of his government, on which he insisted, despite its defeat in the Civil War, depended on the extent to which it could claim to be the custodian of what China stood for, those magnificent achievements of its civilization over the centuries and over the millennia. And this explains why in the Taipei Palace Museum to this day, you can find an extraordinary collection of artifacts and representatives of Chinese culture over the ages. By the end of 1949, he had abandoned any attempt to retain a foothold in southwest China. The cities had fallen. He was being driven from one to the other. And in December 1949, he announced that his government would relocate formally to Taipei on Taiwan. That's the provincial capital. But his chances of survival looked poor. Mao Zedong had taken over all of mainland China and was preparing to launch an amphibious assault on a much larger scale than that required to get across the Yangtze and take Taiwan. The Americans were still not committed to Chiang Kai-shek. The prospect at the end of 1949, the beginning of 1950, was that the communists would take Taiwan too, and that Chiang's government would be thoroughly eradicated. Well, as I think many of you will be aware, what saved Chiang Kai-shek was in fact nothing that happened on the mainland China, but what happened in Korea. When the North Korean government under Kim Jong-il decided to attack the South, and US-led United Nations, including the British, fought back and started moving north towards the Yalu River, Mao Zedong decided that he would have to intervene as well. And he moved Chinese People's Volunteers, who'd only just helped him win the country, across the frontier down into the Korean peninsula. The Americans decided that in these circumstances, Mao was going to be a real threat and Taiwan could not be lost. And so the US 7th Fleet moved into the Taiwan Straits, and Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek regime was saved. And it survived. Chiang died in 1975, Mao in 1976, and still in February 2021, to return to this year of ours again, we still see two Chinas, the Republic of China on Taiwan, the People's Republic of China on the mainland. And this man who rules mainland China, the PRC, on the bottom right of this slide, Xi Jinping, has said this has got to change. His counterpart, the rival Tsai Ing-wen, is president of Taiwan, the woman to the left of him. We see then the long shadow of 1949 cast over China, but not just China, the whole East Asia region, because it's a matter of great moment to the Americans, to Japan, to Southeast Asia, to Korea, what happens in China's unfinished civil war. There are ominous signs that the war might be moving into its final and decisive, or shall we say, conclusive stage. Can that be accomplished peacefully? Is there a prospect of an agreement of the kind that eluded Chiang in 1949? I have to say it looks rather slender, and that it might well be that this longest running civil war in history is brought to an end with violence in the way in which it began. That, ladies and gentlemen, completes our journey. I'm very grateful for your patience and understanding on this long excursion. I do hope you've enjoyed traveling with me through this year, and welcome all comments, criticism, and questions and observations that you might have. And for that purpose, I'm going to hand back to Deborah.
Thank you, Graham. That was absolutely wonderful, including so much stuff that I didn't know. We got a question
while this was going on from Ms. Ebel, who wanted to know, said, I have always wanted to know how was it that Sun Qingling survived under Mao when she was married to Sun Yat-sen and her sister was married to Chiang, yet she was the representative to the USSR. So forgive me for any appalling pronunciations there. And what's the answer to that one?
Not at all. Let me first establish that you can still see me. I can see you, and I hope you can see me. My slides disappeared. Yes. Well, it's a great question. And like all great questions, let me say at the outset, I don't have a conclusive answer for you, but I think I can give you some thoughts that might be used to make up an answer. Firstly, Sun Qingling was the wife of Sun Yat-sen, and Sun Yat-sen occupies an important place in the evolution of modern China and is acknowledged, we might say cherished, though we'd have to be a little bit careful with that word, by both the communists and the nationalists. So in that sense, she's already got a degree of fireproofing to her person and her reputation. If we add to that the fact that she was always opposed to her brother-in-law, Chiang Kai-Shek, and always left-leaning and sympathetic to the Soviet Union, we find, I think, another reason. Now, when the communists took over, she remained in Shanghai and then moved to Beijing and became a vocal supporter of Mao. She may, it is said by some, have become a secret member of the Chinese Communist Party. The communists were quite keen to have her support as an independent, so they might not wanted to have badged her publicly as a member of the party, but she might have been a secret one. But she supported the regime. She presented no threat. She was a symbol of loyalty that might be useful to win over non-partisan Chinese. And though she had a bit of a tough time now and again during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao's cause took on a particular radical nature, she survived that and died peacefully, we believe, in 1981. What we don't know about Sun Qingling, as we don't unfortunately about many of the actors, particularly on the communist side, is what thoughts were in her mind and what passions were in her heart. So I very much agree with the questioner that there is something of an enigma here, and I hope I partly solved it, but would like to leave a little bit intact because an enigma is something that I think we all need alongside the plain facts of the case.
There's also been another question from John Dowdle. Are you there, John? I'll allow you to talk right now, and do just jump straight in if you'd like to ask the question yourself. I think you're muted at the moment, so if you unmute your question, you'll be able to be heard by, sorry, unmute your, are you there? Hello, John. I'm afraid I can't hear you, and we did have this problem last week. It happened to just be a not quite up-to-date version of Zoom. So I'll ask on your behalf. No microphone, he's saying. Oh dear, okay, all right. And this is an interesting question. It is at a later stage, but how did it come that the nationalist government gave up its veto on the UN Security Council to the PRC?
Well, that is a very good question. And just for the sake of those who are with us who might not be quite familiar with the background here, let me just say a little bit about this. Chiang Kai-shek took with him to Taiwan the government of the People's, the government of the Republic of China, or Nationalist China, and he took with him China's representation in the United Nations, moreover in the Security Council of the United Nations, and leaving the PRC, the newly created People's Republic of China, as the real force on the ground in the country, but with diminished international standing. And this was a situation maintained until 1971, and it was largely maintained because of US pressure. They wanted their ally, nationalist China, not red China, in the international community, not Beijing. They wanted to keep Mao out, despite the Soviet view. But what happened essentially was this, that the enthusiasm of the Americans for Chiang's government diminished, and the understanding began to grow that they needed some sort of relationship with Red China, with Mao's China, with the People's Republic of China. It was big, it was powerful, and it was conceived that such a relationship would help the United States in its battle, fortunately a smokeless battle, with the Soviet Union. By this time, Mao had fallen out with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and therefore there was mileage to be gained in prospecting, at least for a relationship with Mao. That couldn't happen as long as Chiang's government was in the UN, and there was growing pressure from other countries. Britain was a bit ambiguous, but not happy about Taiwan being there because it had, as early as 1950, established relations with the PRC. So Britain wasn't very keen on Chiang being there. These were the factors that accounted for the decision of the UN in 1971 to kick Taiwan out and to let Mao's People's Republic of China in.
Thank you. You're getting a lot of very positive comments. Emma says, thanks very much. This was really interesting. Miss Abel was very happy about your reply to the last question. We've also got a comment from Sarah Vaughan in the questions window here. Wonderful overview that inspires further reading. We have a question now from Anna Milsom. Anna, I'm going to put you on if you would like to ask the question yourself. Are you there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Speak up. A little bit quiet, but yeah, we can hear you.
So my question is, do you think that if the US had provided aid to the nationalists, that they would have won? Or do you think that the communist takeover would have happened regardless, due to the peasants' desire for revolution?
It's a great question, Anna, and you will understand well, I'm sure, that it's one of the big questions in historical scholarship, even if it's one of those sort of what-if questions. Those are so valuable, those what-if questions. Let me say, of course, that I don't know, but let me put, rather in the manner of my last answer, one or two little bits of kindling into the fire for you to think about subsequently. Could the Americans have rescued Chiang Kai-shek and kept him in power? I think the answer is that they probably could have kept him in power for a bit longer than remained the case in the mainland, but they would find it very difficult to enable him to retake the ground that he had lost at the beginning of 1949 and that he would lose during that year. So it might have slowed the progress of the communist advance by bolstering Chiang's regime, but not more. The solution to Chiang's problems had to come from Chiang himself and in the form of a relationship between him and his government and his military and the Chinese people. It couldn't really be worked by an external force like the United States. The question, however, is a very big one in this sense. Were the communists bound to win? And what followed 1949 in terms, for example, of the great upheavals, the persecution and elimination, indeed, of the landlords, the suppression of intellectuals, the great famines of the 1950s that were largely man and woman made, and the Cultural Revolution? Were all these things inevitable and part of the communist revolution? That's in a sense related to this question. And when one considers the outcome of 1949 and says, well, you could say that the right cause won, you do have, I think, to look at that longer perspective and say, can we disentangle what happened in 1949 from what happened later and the horrors that were inflicted on the Chinese people by the victors in 1949. That wasn't inevitable. That was a contingent catastrophe that goes to the sadness that I think is still very much apparent when one thinks about China's modern history. Thank you for the question.
Of Russia in 1917, actually, same thing. You knew something was going to change, but it didn't have to take that form.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
And we've got another comment from Anne-Marie this time. Fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I've tried to read this area of history so many times, having left school age 15, and now I understand it so much better, and you made it so interesting. So that's really good.
I'm delighted to hear that, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
We've got a question from Sarah Vaughan. Let me just find you, Sarah, and I'll switch your sound on. There we go. Are you able to speak, Sarah?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
You alluded to the falling out between Mao and Russia. And I'm unfortunately a beginner in this area of history, but I would love to know a few of the fundamental issues over which the two countries struggled at that time and eventually came apart.
Thank you, Sarah.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a very good question. Let me just illustrate some of the main issues at work. We referred in our journey through 1949 to some of the anxieties and distrust that Stalin felt about Mao. I suppose that's a good place to start because Soviet influence, you will recall at this time, was spreading rapidly through Eastern Europe, those parts of the continent that had been liberated from Nazi rule by the Soviet Red Army. Polities, institutions were created there that were very heavily skewed towards the Soviet Union, and it wasn't long before Stalin, the USSR, had its satellites, as they became known there, part of the global socialist camp. Now, Mao never looked like being a satellite, and Stalin was concerned that China was so far away, that it was so big. We mustn't overdo that, because when Mao, at the end of 1949, made his first foreign journey, it was to Moscow, and he secured a treaty of assistance and mutual aid with Stalin. He got a big whack of money, he got lots of Soviet advisors, and for large part of the 1950s, New China, as it was called, was very heavily Soviet influenced. The Soviet Union was the lodestar. The China's tomorrow is the Soviet Union today, or was the propaganda slogan that many Chinese were encouraged to adhere to. But Mao, after 10 years in power, then took a different view about the Soviet Union. Stalin had died in 1953. Khrushchev in 1956 had denounced Stalin. Khrushchev had said we ought to try and get on with the Americans. For Mao, this was very unsatisfactory. This wasn't why the revolution had been built. It wasn't for coexistence. It was for conquering the world. And he felt that the Soviet Union was becoming bureaucratic. It had abandoned socialism. It was what he called revisionist. China under Mao was having none of that. And so he turned on the Soviet Union big time, and it was attacked in street protests, demonstrations. The Soviet advisors were kicked out, and Mao set upon his own revolutionary road. As I say that, Sarah, it occurs to me that there might be a parallel in the modern world with countries being subjected to populism, to setting their face against globalization, to wanting to go their own way, and to emphasizing their own sovereignty. I don't think I need to mention too many countries to bring that point home. Well, something similar happened with regard to global socialism in the 1950s. The present day populism is thought of often as a rebellion against present day globalization. Something similar was at work in the 1950s. Mao was a China firstist. He wanted to make China great again. And that meant ditching the Soviet Union, which had, in his view, abandoned the true revolutionary cause. I hope that provides at least something in the way of an answer to your very interesting question.
Thank you ever so much for this talk. It's been fascinating, and the comments in the chat window showed us just that the attendees here have enjoyed it very much as well. So thank you very much, Graham.
My pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to share this afternoon with you and yours.
Thank you for doing it. I'd also like to remind everybody that Conway Hall Ethical Society is a charitable ethical society. I know that we're all hurting financially at the moment. It's a difficult time, but if you possibly can donate, please do. It makes a difference. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.